Price discrimination. Well, when we entered this larger unit on pricing with market power, we kind of joked that we went from the black and white world of Kansas to the colorful world of Oz. Well, now we're about to move from the colorful world of pricing with market power with a single price to more complicated forms of pricing involving multiple prices. So if we want to continue the kind of the cinematic analogies, I think we're going 3D now. So what is price discrimination? Well, price discrimination is charging different prices to different consumers in an attempt to raise producer surplus. The most extreme version of this is called first-degree price discrimination, and that's literally charging a different price to each consumer. Now, here's a quick refresher. This is just a picture of monopoly pricing without price discrimination, or just single price monopoly pricing. And as I'm sure we all remember, this firm has a downward sloping demand curve, there's D, and an associated marginal revenue curve that bisects the demand curve. This firm has a marginal cost curve, which you can see there as MC. The firm chooses the quantity of output where MC equals MR, and there's the profit maximizing quantity. It goes up to the demand curve to find that price, and there's the profit maximizing price. Now, by doing that, it divides up the areas between demand and supply curve in the following way. Consumers pay PM per unit and consume QM units, and so this triangle up here is consumer surplus when there's a single price monopolist. This shape here that has no name is producer surplus, because sellers get this price PM, or I should say the seller, the monopoly seller, gets PM per unit, but only incurs marginal costs down here, and summing up across all those units, this big area here is producer surplus. And then finally, this area over here is deadweight loss. There's some deadweight loss in the situation where there's a single price monopolist not using any price discrimination. Now, to talk about first-degree price discrimination, I'd like to illustrate this idea of charging a different price to each consumer and talk about the implications it has for marginal revenue. So, first of all, think about arranging consumers in descending order of willingness to pay. Now, by the way, that's what the demand curve is. The demand curve puts the highest point as the highest valuation consumer, and then the next highest valuation consumer, and so forth. So that's just the demand curve. Now, what first-degree price discrimination is, it means charging each consumer his or her price on the demand curve. So take that consumer number 1, he or she's willing to pay this amount here, which we call P1, and charge P1 to that first consumer. And now find that second consumer, number 2, and charge that consumer this price here, which is P2. So consumer 1 pays one price, P1, whereas consumer 2 pays a different price. So this is a contrast with regular old monopoly pricing where we just had a single price. Here we're charging a different price to each consumer. Now, what's interesting about this, there are a couple of things. First, I'll talk about it kind of in terms of the diagram. It means that the demand curve now also shows marginal revenue, because we're being sneaky here. We're charging that high price to consumer number 1, and then we're charging a lower price to consumer number 2, but we're maintaining that higher price with consumer number 1. And then, having charged those pretty high prices to consumers 1 and 2, then we charge the next highest price to consumer number 3. And so as a result, the marginal revenue, the additional revenue for selling one more unit, well, we read it right off of the demand curve. And so the demand curve becomes also the marginal revenue curve. Now, what's a little bit tricky about this, or maybe sneaky, is that this means that different people are paying different prices, and that's not only something that might be upsetting to people, but it also means we can only do this in a situation where individuals can't turn around and sell products to each other. So we kind of need a no arbitrage situation. Well, now let's talk about the welfare impacts of first-degree price discrimination. Regular old single-price monopoly that we just saw a couple of slides ago divided up that area between demand and marginal cost into these 3 regions: producer surplus and consumer surplus, and then there was some deadweight loss. But if we instead engage in first-degree price discrimination and do it successfully, well, what's interesting is the entire area, this entire region, becomes producer surplus. So with first-degree price discrimination, the producer surplus area remains producer surplus relative to a single price monopoly, but consumer surplus, the stuff that used to go to consumers, and the stuff that used to be deadweight loss, all become producer surplus. Now, in some sense, there's good news and bad news here. It's really efficient. That's the good news. I mean, it's efficient in the sense that there's no deadweight loss, but there's a transfer from consumers to producers. Now, this isn't unambiguously bad, but to the extent that consumers tend to be less wealthy than producers, this can be a transfer from the poorer to the richer, which we might frown upon. Now, what are some examples of first-degree price discrimination? It's probably accurate to say that first-degree price discrimination is mostly a theoretical benchmark of kind of the most extreme one could possibly accomplish with charging different prices to different people. Still, there are a few examples in real life that are a bit like this. You know, old-fashioned car buying involved going to the car dealer, and you'd chat a while with the dealer, and then he or she would ask the sales manager for a price, and they'd size you up. You'd sit there for a long time. They'd come back with a price, I suspect, based on what they thought you were willing to pay. And so it had the flavor of first-degree price discrimination. Of course, nowadays people are much better informed when they shop for cars because of the internet and other forms of information technology, so this isn't so extreme as it once was. Another example, though, that hits close to home for many of us is the example of college financial aid. I mean, almost in your dreams, when you think as a producer about trying to do first-degree price discrimination, what is it you'd like to do? You'd like to sit down with your customer and get a glimpse into his or her bank account, figure out how much, you'd like to look at their pay stub, you'd like to look at their bank account, their wealth holdings, and then choose a price based on that. Now take a look at this. This is the college financial aid form, the government form that families need to fill out to figure out how much to pay for junior's college education. And look at some of the questions on the form. Well, what was your parents' adjusted gross income for 2010? Here's a nice one. As of today, what is your parents' total current balance of cash, savings, and checking accounts? As of today, what is the net worth of your parents' investments, including real estate, and so forth? So it's really a wonderful glimpse into how much the family can pay, and the price then gets set on that basis. Just as an interesting, or to me interesting aside, I mean, every year you see that colleges announce their sticker prices, and there's a news story about how expensive college is. It's always puzzling to me why colleges don't just announce a tuition of, say $1 million a year and just give out lots more financial aid. Because after all, some people could afford a lot more than the sticker price of $50,000 and might be willing to pay it. Charging them $1 million could pay for lots of needy kids to go to school. But that's just a thought. All right, that's first degree. Let's move on to what's called third degree price discrimination. We won't talk in this part of the course about second degree price discrimination. Third degree, and by the way, it is kind of interesting that price discrimination is named in the same way that burns are named, first, second, and third degree. But in any event, these kinds of price discrimination aren't based on how severe they are, but some historical accident. What third degree price discrimination is segmenting the market into groups that have different demand curves, and then selling these different groups the same product but at different prices. Now, just kind of something to mention at this point, if the marginal cost depends on quantity, which in principle, in general, it could, this gets a little complicated. So in our examples, we'll stick with constant marginal costs. That conveys all the important intuitions, but I just thought I'd mention that at this point. I also want to talk about some examples of segmentation before we jump into the math, because I think these are widespread, interesting, and realistic. So one example that comes to mind for me is malls versus outlet stores. To a large extent, although not completely, they sell the same things, or many of the same things, but the outlet stores sell things at much lower prices. The outlet stores, though, tend to be kind of tucked a little bit far away, And so that's a way of segmenting people. People who are very price sensitive, willing to drive long distances to get lower prices, can go get those lower prices. And the other people who are either busy or not interested in doing that, go ahead and pay the higher prices at malls that are nearby. And so you might say the strategy for segmentation is to put those outlet stores far enough away so that busy, high income or whatever, busy people don't go there. Another example that is pretty prevalent is age-related discounts, for example, at the movies. But if you look around, you can find lots of age-related discounts. For example, as it says here, an AARP, that's American Association of Retired Persons, an AARP card will get you 20% off at Denny's and a free donut with the purchase of a large coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. Lots of other examples like that. Now their segmentation takes the form of just verifying age. So you can segment people that way. And when you're selling something like a donut, it's pretty hard to transfer that from one person to another. I don't want to buy a donut that some other person's already touched, or a coffee cup that's gotten cold. Similar, you can't really transfer a movie ticket very easily. Another example that we see a lot of is segmentation in airfares. And there the issue is that some travelers are business travelers and some travelers are leisure travelers. And the business travelers tend to be willing to pay quite a lot more. I mean, they're not actually doing the paying, their company is. And so just as an example of this, let's take a look at a Minneapolis-St. Paul to Boston round trip, leaving on a Thursday 6 months in advance. But we'll look at various different return dates, some of which put the trip into the weekend. So we'll take a little field trip to Expedia. So here's what it looks like if we go out Thursday and then come back on a Sunday. And notice in every case we're looking at the same flights. There are Delta flights out of Minneapolis at 7 a.m. and then returning from Boston on the flight that leaves at 8:25 a.m. So if we go out Thursday and come back Sunday, the round trip is $460. If we go out Thursday and come back on Saturday, so we're not staying over Saturday night anymore. Now, using the same flights, but just the only difference is it's Saturday, the round trip is $560. Well, what if we go out Thursday, come back Friday? That's almost surely a business traveler who has to get back in time to help the spouse with, family issues. And that traveler is going to pay $1,032 out Thursday, back Friday. Again, same flights, except on the different day for the return. So this looks very much like a strategy to segment business travelers from leisure travelers. All right, enough anecdotes and illustrations. It's time to jump into the modeling. And so let's talk about a model of pricing with segmentation, or as we said before, third-degree price discrimination. Now we'll work with a model of 2 segments, but of course it could be more. It wouldn't even make the math much harder, but 2 segments is enough to make our points. So the idea here is we have 2 segments, each with its own demand curve. And so segment 1, or group 1, has the demand curve P equals 20 minus Q1. Group 2 has the demand curve P equals 30 minus 2 times Q2. Total costs, well, we'll keep the cost structure pretty simple. It doesn't have to be this simple, but this is what we'll do. Total costs equal just 10 times QT, where QT is Q1 plus QT. So you can see that marginal cost is 10 just because total costs go up by 1 every time quantity goes up by, total costs go up by 10 every time quantity goes up by 1. Now, the way this works in some ways is really simple, and we already know it. I mean, once you've done the segmentation, and given that the marginal costs are constant, all you do is single price monopoly pricing in each segment. So segment 1 had the demand curve P equals 20 minus Q1, and so the associated marginal revenue curve that bisects it is right there, P equals 20 minus 2Q1. Marginal cost is equal to 10, and so what we do here is we just set MR equals MC, and that's what's happening in this line right here. The result is that the profit maximizing quantity for segment 1 is 5. You get the price just by going up to the demand curve, and that price is 15. So we found the answer for one of the 2 segments. Then let's take a look at group 2. So if you recall, group 2's Now let's take a look at group 2. If you recall, group 2's demand curve was P equals 30 minus 2Q2. The associated marginal revenue, MR2, is 30 minus 4Q2. Marginal cost is the same in these two segments. Remember, this stuff's being produced somewhere and just being shipped off to these two segments, but the marginal cost is the same. So setting MR equals MC, what happens right here, 30 minus 4Q2 equals 10, and so as it happens, Q2 equals 5. Now let's find P2. Well, we go up to the demand curve, and we plug in 5. So it's P2 equals 30 minus 2 times 5, or 20. Now what's the resulting overall profit? So this pi PD is profit with price discrimination. It's price in segment 1 times quantity in segment 1 plus price in segment 2 times quantity in segment 2 minus the total cost of the quantity QT. So what is that in this context? Well, it was 15 times 5 plus 20 times 5 minus then total cost is just 10 times 10 because this was a cost function that had no fixed costs, just marginal costs. And we find that the answer is 75. So profit selling into these two segments when we can, well, differentiate them or segment them into these two groups is 75. The question we want to ask is how much have we raised profits? And to compare that, we need to figure out what it would have meant to sell into this group if they hadn't been segmentable, if it had just been one group. So what that means is we need the overall demand curve that we would have faced if we were unable to segment. So for this, what we need to do to find that overall demand curve, we need to horizontally sum the segment demand curves. So here we have a picture. On the left-hand side, we have group 1 demand. Remember, it hits the price axis at 20. Slope is minus 1, so it hits the quantity axis at 20. Let's also then put in group 2's demand, which hits the price axis at 30. Let's also put in group 2's demand. So that one hits the price axis at 30. It has a slope of minus 2, and so it hits the quantity axis at 15. Now the brown demand curve on the right-hand side arises from horizontally summing the two demand curves that were on the left. So think about, well, prices like 30. At a price between 20 and 30, only segment 2 is in the market. So this component here just reproduces the high part of demand curve number 2. But once we get down to a price of 20, both segments are in the market. And by the way, this is going to be the relevant segment because we're not trying to be tricky in this class. So at this point, we have all that demand that's coming from segment 2. As we move to prices below 20, we pick up demand from both. Now, what would this point over here be? Well, it should be the sum of the 15, which is where demand curve 2 hits the quantity axis, and the 20, where demand curve 1 hits the quantity axis, and indeed, it's 35. So you can see this visually. We'll do it mathematically in a moment. Here it is mathematically. So this is the demand curve in segment 1, and this is segment 2. Horizontal summation requires us to add up quantities. So we need to re-express this demand curve here as Q1 equals 20 minus P. We need to re-express this one as Q2 equals 15 minus a half P, which, by the way, we get just by dividing everything by 2. When we sum Q1 plus Q2 to get QT, what we have is it equals 20 plus 15, or 35, minus 1 minus a half, or minus 3 halves times P. And again, this is really only relevant or accurate for prices below 20 because of the kink on the last slide's picture. But let's go over to here. What we're doing here is re-expressing this demand curve in terms of P. So we're just doing some multiplying and so forth to get it in terms of P. And finally, what we can do is bisect this demand curve to get the marginal revenue curve. Now, nothing's changed on the cost, Nothing's changed on the cost side, so marginal cost equals 10. Let's step back though and say, what is it that we've actually done? Well, what we've actually found is the equation of the overall demand curve in the region where both segments are in the market. So that's what this is. Now this isn't the answer yet. To get the answer, then we've got to take our demand curve and its associated marginal revenue curve, and we need to set MR equal to MC. So what have we here? Here's MC, 10. Here's MR from the previous page. Well, if we solve that, we get that the optimal quantity, Q star, is 10. If we plug that into the demand curve here, so this is the overall demand curve we derived, and just be a little bit careful, this guy here is marginal revenue, whereas this guy here is demand, and you can see that they have the same intercept but different slopes. Well, anyways, plugging that optimal quantity of 10 into the demand curve gives us, well, if we trace through, a price of 16.33. Now, just a quick reality check here. Think back to the part of the example when we segmented. What were the prices? Well, in one segment it was 15, in the other segment it was 20. So an overall price of 16.33, which is of course between 15 and 20, doesn't seem crazy. Seems like maybe we're on the right track. Anyways, let's follow along and calculate out the profits. So this is the profits, just regular old monopoly profits when we're just a single price monopolist. So we'll plug in the P that we found here, the 16.33 times the 10, that's 163.3, and minus TC, well, there are 10 units of output here, so this is minus 10 times 10. And what do we get? We get 63.33 as profit. Remember, we got a profit of 75 with segmentation. So the punchline here is that profits are higher with price discrimination, or in this case third degree price discrimination, than without. Now in some ways that's a revelation and it's very interesting. In some ways it couldn't very well have been otherwise, because we always could have just charged the same price in the two segments when we segmented, so we could not possibly have done worse with our best segmented prices. But how much better we would have done, that's not so clear. Turns out, though, that we do better, and so that is comforting. All right, let's move on to another form of price discrimination. It's really just kind of another version of segmentation, but it's segmenting across time as opposed to across space or across particular consumers. So the example here is called intertemporal price discrimination. And the idea is charging different amounts at different points in time. Two products where this is very prevalent are movies and books. A way to think about it is in terms of the following two pictures. On the left-hand side, we have a demand curve associated with early, so right after release. And at that point, there's certain people who just feel like a very intense desire to see it. So you see this steep, kind of inelastic demand curve and the associated marginal revenue curve. Well, when we find the intersection of MR and MC and go up to demand, we have a high price. Later on, after these eager beavers have seen it, a year or whatever amount of time later, the folks left who haven't yet seen it are the people who are not so eager. They have more elastic demand, and their associated marginal revenue curve is here. We find the intersection of MR and MC, and by the way, MC hasn't necessarily changed, so I've drawn it here as though it were the same. And find the price, and this later price is lower. Tracing back, lower. Turns out this has been a very, very successful strategy in some products. Movies come to mind as one where it's been a very big deal. The process of making movies available through different distribution channels, or different windows if you will, has this name windowing in movies. This is slightly dated information at this point, but it very nicely illustrates the point. In the mid-2000s, if you kind of calculated the realized retail price per viewing across these different ways to see a movie, you found the following. Seeing a movie in a theater cost about $5.81 per viewing. Seeing a movie via a purchased video was about $3.69 per viewing. Seeing it via video rental was about $1.13 per viewing. Pay-per-view or video on demand, about $1.50 per viewing. Watching a movie on a premium channel like HBO, that came down to about 76 cents per viewing. And by the way, these are all kind of calculated from prices divided by numbers of viewings. So, the thing like the premium channel viewing is an HBO subscription divided by the number of movies on average people actually watch in a month, that sort of thing. Watching a movie on basic cable came down to about 46 cents per viewing, and on broadcast TV, 0. But you're seeing all these different ways to see movies, different ways to generate revenue, in addition to kind of the obvious traditional one, theaters. Now, has this been successful? Well, it's been fantastically successful. In 1948, essentially all of the revenue to the movie industry came through theatrical viewing. So this is all in current dollars, and so 100% of the revenue, $8.5 billion in 2007 dollars, came from theatrical. As we move up the time scale to much more recent periods, we see that theatrical has really shrunk as a share of total revenue. It was 100% back in 48. It's about 20% in the late 2000s. And these other distribution channels have become very, very important, obviously, since they're like 80%. The picture shows it well. The blue is theatrical, and we have video and TV. Essentially, by using this strategy of intertemporal price discrimination, the movie industry has radically increased its revenue. Okay, not all is rosy in price discrimination. In some sense you hear the word price discrimination and it sounds a little bit pernicious, and in fact there is some opposition mounting to some forms of it. If you look around a little bit, you find, for example, that Miami-Dade County prohibits businesses from charging different prices for goods and services based, for example, solely on gender. Dry cleaning was the service that really brought this to mind for many people. Well, why on earth is a men's shirt $2 and a woman's blouse $4 or something like that? And we can think of reasons why that would be, and it probably has to do with elasticities of demand, but that doesn't make it free of being objectionable. There are similar issues in haircutting, and in fact there's now a law in New York City that prohibits different prices for haircutting across gender. And so there are some issues with concern about charging different prices to different people. Of course, it's illegal to charge different prices to different people based on race. Okay. So price discrimination, while it can be somewhat controversial, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out that price discrimination can also be good for society. And so let me just give you this example to make the point. Suppose that the demand curve is 100, P equals 100 minus Q. And make this really simple. Let's say marginal costs are 0. And that sounds far-fetched, but there are a lot of products where it's pretty close to being true. It's close to being, or it is true for media products. It's pretty close to being true for a lot of products like pharmaceuticals, where it doesn't cost much to make another pill. It just costs a whole heck of a lot to invent the product in the first place. Anyways, though, the question we want to ask is, what's the value to society of making this product available? And that's going to be the area under the demand curve, which, as we'll see for this demand curve, is 5,000. So the full area under the demand curve is a measure of the benefit to society of making it available. Now suppose the fixed costs of making it available equal 3,000. Well, what's important about that is then the benefits are bigger than the costs, and so this is something that's worth doing. All right? It would be a good thing to do. Without any price discrimination, though, the maximum revenue that can be obtained from this demand curve is a revenue of $2,500. I'll show you all this in a second. And so the point is, the market can't do this without price discrimination. So it should be done, but the market can't do it. What do? So let's look at it in a picture. The value to society from making this product available is equal to the whole area under this demand curve. The area under this demand curve, it's this triangle. It's 100 times 100 divided by 2, or 5,000. The fixed costs, which you don't see in this diagram, but they're the costs that we have to balance this benefit against, are 3,000. So again, we should do this. If there were an omniscient planner, he or she would elect to do this. What's the revenue available with a single price, so without price discrimination? We find that in the usual way. Marginal costs are zero. So the intersection of marginal revenue with marginal cost occurs right here. The quantity is 50, the price is 50, and the revenue available with that single price is 50 times 50, or 2,500. And so again, this doesn't cover fixed costs, and so without price discrimination, this product will not be brought to market. However, price discrimination of some form that could generate more revenue than just the 2,500 could allow this product to be brought to market. Now, these concerns aren't completely far-fetched. Some of the products we've already mentioned have very high fixed costs, and in many cases small marginal costs. And price discrimination turns out to be an important part, or at least it could be an important part of the strategy for making these products feasible and making it possible to bring them to market. So Hollywood movies. Well, the members of the Motion Picture Association of America spend an average of something like $100 million per film to bring their films to market. That's pretty expensive, and so it would be handy for them and perhaps for us as well if they could find lots of different ways to generate revenue to produce those exciting movies. Pharmaceutical products are maybe even a more extreme example. There are various estimates out there of the costs of bringing a new drug to market. Some estimates hover around $1 billion. Some are much higher. In part these are very high because they, I think rightly, add up all of the costs they incur to try to invent drugs, and they include in that sum the drugs that they don't successfully invent, that is, that don't make it through approval, and divide that by the number of drugs that actually do make it to market. And again, you get a number like at least $1 billion per drug. So that's a lot of money, and we'd all like to see these useful drugs brought to market. So if price discrimination is part of what can make that happen, it might be a good thing. So I guess summing up, price discrimination can raise surplus in such instances, so that could be a good thing. But you do need to worry about the legitimacy of doing these things. For example, these price discrimination schemes at haircut places or dry cleaners by gender are really controversial and seem in some ways odious. One way to think about this maybe is to make a distinction between discounts and surcharges. I mean, nobody likes to be told, hey, you're paying extra because you're whatever. But, discounts for senior citizens and so forth seem to be very palatable to most people. Okay, what are the takeaways from this discussion of price discrimination? Well, first of all, price discrimination raises producer surplus, and therefore it's reducing that other stuff, the consumer surplus and dead weight loss. Not necessarily both of them, but certainly there's some. Next, first degree or person-specific price discrimination eliminates consumer surplus and dead weight loss. So depending on how you think, that's either unambiguously good or at least partly good and partly questionable. But it certainly is efficient because it eliminates dead weight loss. Third degree price discrimination, which means segment and charge monopoly prices in each group, is another strategy that can raise profit. And we can sort of do problems that have to do with that, but that requires us to know how to do that horizontal summation here. So I want that to be something you take away, is how to horizontally sum segment demand curves to get an overall demand curve. Last points I'd make, though, are that price discrimination can be controversial, but it can also be socially beneficial. So it's worth thinking about. It's not necessarily bad. It's quite possibly good.